Welcome to this video on secrets of the psyche of vampires. We're going to get into some kind of strange materials here, and I'm going to explain what the key points are and why we're having this conversation. Before we begin, though, I have a request to make, and the request is simply this. If you're intent on watching this video, I would ask that you turn off your cell phone. If you have a ringtone or a volume setting on your home phone, your landline, turn it off. If your doorbell rings while you're watching this video, don't answer it. If you get text messages or any kind of form of interruption, avoid them. If you're going to really seriously watch this material, sequester some time off. Plant yourself someplace private where you will not be interrupted, and really pay attention. And I'll explain why I'm asking you to do that a little bit later if I can remember in the rest of this video. But there's a reason for that. I'm pretty sure that a significant number of our viewers, if they decide that this information is important to them, and they're watching this video, and if there's any lights that are going on in their head, I would almost bet and count on the apparent sudden coincidence of you being constantly interrupted as soon as the light is going to flash on inside of your head, or if you have an aha moment or a realization that's really meaningful and important to you. So let's just anticipate those accidental, spontaneous interruptions that just seem to come out of nowhere beforehand, and take every action before we begin to make sure that they don't interrupt you. And if something happens and there's such an incredible interruption that absolutely demands your attention, then I would suggest that do your best to stop or pause this video and choose another time where you can actually sit down and watch this. But I'll get into that in more detail. I want to thank everybody just for the feedback on previous videos that I've given, and I am reading as many of the comments as I can, and I feel very touched and very gratified that people are feeling that they've been served by this and they're benefiting from it. I do occasionally get comments of a sort of a flaming nature that's all across the table. I just want to state something up front here. The purpose of this video is to empower you, it's to help you, it's to inspire you, it's to give you hope, and most importantly, it's to equip you, and to equip you with understandings that are going to make a difference in your life, that are going to make your life a better place to be. Hopefully it will keep you safe, it will make you stronger, better able to achieve and actualize, important, beautiful things that uplift you and those that you know. It isn't meant for entertainment. And if you like to watch reality TV shows and get your daily dose of sugar, and you're looking for diversion, or you are hoping I'm going to be some funny guy that's going to stimulate you or tell you some kind of like scary story that you can tell your friends about over a beer and have giggles over, whatever the heck it is, you need to most likely turn this video off now, and you need to go away, because I'm not interested in talking to you, and I don't care if you write me comments and tell me that you think that I didn't entertain you enough. This material isn't for you, and there's lots of other avenues that you can take. So for those of you that are tuned in and are resonating with the work that I'm doing and are interested and open to what I have to say, I want to begin to share some key points with you. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a background history as to what you're about to hear, how it's evolved, and why it's being presented. Many of you who follow my work know that I've been involved in the study of consciousness, and that's encompassed a lot of different areas. And it's been done over the span of over 10 years, and it's been very in-depth, serious work that I've spent an awful lot of time doing. I've had a lot of really good teachers along the way, and I haven't arrived at all of my understandings and conclusions entirely on my own. Some of my discoveries, I think, are new and unique and novel to my line of work, and I've also received a lot of support, and I've made my own synthesis and interpretation of things. So the material that you're going to be hearing is a combination of my own subjective, personal take on the subject material. I will also assert that some of the material that I'll be sharing with you is factual and that you can examine it for yourself. I'm not looking to preach or proselytize my philosophy or point of view. You can take whatever part of what I'm sharing with you and do whatever you want with it. And part of our journey here is I'm going to be sharing anecdotes and stories, metaphors, and also real-life events. My goal and hope is to try to form a picture in your mind. And I have my own unique way of expressing things. It may or may not, resonate with you. So again, you can choose however you want to deal with it. I will be providing citations and references to material that you can and should examine on your own. And I'm going to begin just by sharing some stories with you. And before we dive right into the actual material, one of the things that's happened to me over the last 10 years plus is that during the work that I was doing, subjectively to me and to others who were witness to my work, there would be a feeling as though at times something was being experienced that seemed to be out of the ordinary. And in some cases, people who had out of the ordinary experiences, not related to my work, at least not initially, would often ask me questions if I could, share my thoughts on things or my insight or, what did I think was going on. And so I've had a lot of private conversations, and these are private conversations with friends, sometimes family, people that I had a local, relationship with. They might have been like, like a friend, it could have been an acquaintance, that I had a degree of trust for. It could have been like very, very close friends, and also members. There's been times where I'll get private correspondence from members who are going through a certain kind of experience, and they want to know what I think. And sometimes members will contact me and will retain me. They'll pay a retainer fee for my time, and I'll provide a kind of consultancy back to them on a range of topics. This can be like on how best to use my frequency-related work, or it can be on just the nature of consciousness, or they might want to use some of the other services that I provide that I don't usually promote publicly very much. And so in the course of those kinds of conversations, these kinds of subjects come up. And in this video presentation, my hope is to try to do my best to remember what some of the most reoccurring and important key points are and have been, so that I can encapsulate and share some of this with you in the hopes that it will benefit you. I knew at some point that I needed to do this and probably should do this, and I haven't had the time. I've been doing a lot of other kinds of math-related work, and that takes up a lot of my energy, time, and day-to-day. But it was becoming apparent and abundantly clear that at some point, because these topics kept coming up, and I was beginning to feel like a parrot, reaching into the bag and saying, oh, well, here you go, this is the piece that I think fits here. I needed to at least take some of that material and present it. So this is hopefully going to be as short as possible and as concise as possible to give you some feedback on what my perspective is, and to point you in a direction where you can do some more digging and your own legwork. I'm not going to present all of the information that I am aware of in this video. There may be members or people that might want to get more information from, in regards to my perspective, and if so, you can follow up with me, and if I'm able to, I will do the best that I can, I can to fill you in. And if you also want to, book a session with me to cover a very specific topic, you're welcome to do that, and I will do the best I can to facilitate you there. So I want to start off with some stories and some sort of anecdotes. A number of years ago, I was watching a documentary, and the documentary was on the developmental behavior of children. And there was a age range, a window. It was roughly, if I recall, between the age of 5 up till about the age of 12. And what they were doing is they were going into elementary or grade schools, early development schools, and they were surveying children. They were asking, they actually had different forums out, and they were getting individual children one-on-one and asking them specific questions, and then they were getting groups of children into a classroom, and they would, ask a group question. So what they were looking for was basically to see how a child would respond in a given situation and why they would respond that way. So I won't go into covering the entire thing because it was a lengthy documentary, but one of the most important points that they made in there, which really struck me as profound, and it's very germane to our conversation, is that they found that typically, and this is cross-culture, so not just in the domestic U.S. or Canada, North America, but this was a generic finding, if I recall correctly. The most popular children in school were the most adept liars. They were the most dishonest consistently. So those children that seemed to have the greatest appeal in the group structure were those that were the most deceitful and dishonest. And they studied these children very closely. And what they found was that they tended to have, on average, a greater aesthetic appeal. So they tended to have, a greater kind of face or body symmetry. They seemed to have enough of the right stuff, material objects, clothing, whatever. They would go on the trips to Disneyland, where the other children didn't. So there was often a material advantage, not always, but more often than not. And they had this ability to lie to their fellow classmate or classmates with a complete poker face. It was almost as though they were born this way. Now, obviously, there must have been some kind of familial or environmental conditioning occurring at home, one would think. This brings up the whole question of nature versus nurture. Does a person arrive at their personality type solely from their environment, or from inheriting it, genetically, etc. But regardless, what they found was that those children that had the widest popular appeal were the ones that could lie the best. And then what they found, they followed these children up, because the test was not just done in a brief range of time with children, but they followed these children up over years to see, where they ended up. And they found that a number of them were groomed to have positions of social status in, the area that they were growing up in. So this could be like, executive class or, politicians or whatever the heck it was. And it was surmised, if I recall by the study, that many of the people that get to places of position of power in our contemporary modern world are coming almost exclusively from that pool of children. And that struck me as being very interesting and unusual. And I wanted to introduce the subject material, with that insertion. When I was doing the bulk of the research that I was doing and the development over the last 10 years, I had to cover a lot of different areas, domains. My background is in computing science, and I have a background in art as well. And I have a background, in other areas, in alternative science and technology. You can find out more information about who I am and what my credentials are and what my expertise is if you want. You can watch the other videos on my YouTube site. But one of the things that I found in my journey as I was developing my math model for the frequency technology and other things that I was working on was some really weird and kind of anomalous nuggets that I would find in areas of psychology and the behavioral sciences, cognitive sciences, etc. And I've studied psychology. I'm not a psychologist, but I would be going into the area and trying to compare different concepts from disparate fields to get a better handle on it in relation to the model that I was working on. And when I was doing that, I'd have my own little lights going off inside my head. And one of the areas that I got into was cultural anthropology and the belief systems of ancient peoples. It's a long story as to the why, but what I would do is I would survey some of the concepts floating around in, again, disparate cultures, ethnicities, and then I would compare it to a contemporary school of thought in, say, psychology or some other behavioral science, like the social sciences, etc. And this image began to form, and it was congruent across these different fields. You know, it would always have, say, a slightly different kind of detail to it, or a slightly different look and feel, but the basic premise was the same, and I really began to stand up and pay attention. Now, you know, in our forums and some of the conversations I have, sometimes the focus is on alternative sciences or the sciences, you know, a conventional perspective. And sometimes it goes into like way off mainstream, you know, like people like to talk about crazy things like, you know, fantastic subjects. I shouldn't say crazy, but just like on the fringe, a lot of fringe stuff. And because some of the material that we cover, you know, can often be, you know, labeled by the mainstream as, you know, kind of like conspiracy or, you know, fringe or whatever, the kind of conventional person might, you know, tend to label it a certain way and then discard it. But I think that a person who is not wearing the narrow blindfold of, you know, convention, or is not simply a wacko, you know, conspiracy nut, but is actually trying to do their due diligence and take a very, as much as possible, an objective, serious look at a body of material. I think that with an open mind, it's very difficult, you know, to arrive at, you know, conclusions that will vary much from what I'm trying to present here to you. And this is just my opinion. But one of these concepts that, or these notions that kept coming up, was of a certain kind of person, a certain kind of class of people, and it was a class of people that was distinct from the rest of humanity. And this distinction had a number of characteristics that transcended the boundaries of the different ethnicities and cultural groups. In other words, there was virtually a one-to-one relationship across the table. And this began to capture my attention and interest, and it was a little bit disturbing in some ways. And I didn't pay undue attention to it through a lot of my research. I just kind of noted it and went on. But at some point it became so prevalent that I realized that this was something I needed to actually pay serious attention to. And I began to wonder if I could find any kind of correspondence of this phenomena in the contemporary sciences, you know, or in contemporary, or through a contemporary investigation through known applied sciences, you know, to see if some of these characteristics would emerge. And I found that they did, and it really surprised me. In the comment section of this YouTube video, when you scroll down, you'll see some links, and you can go and investigate those and, you know, follow up and check them out. I also found that there were correspondences in contemporary esoterica. Now, you know, for those of you that are more rational or more, you know, scientific-minded, I can understand, you know, the caution when approaching like an esoteric or metaphysical body of information, and that's fine. I mean, you know, I'm cautious myself. I would suggest, however, that if one applies, again, due diligence and a fine-tooth comb, an honest analysis of a body of material, whether it's esoteric or not, that certain key points, when compared to key points from other vistas, warrant serious investigation. So this profile that was emerging from these different avenues was one of a type of human being that seemed different from other human beings in the following ways. They tended to lack empathy. They didn't tend to have an actual conscience. They tended to have certain kinds of biological characteristics that differentiated them from other human beings. They had certain kinds of behavior patterns that were consistently more dominant over time than other human beings. in some of the older literature or some of the older belief systems, there was a thought that these individuals did not have what these groups would qualify as being a soul or a spirit, that they were essentially like hollow human beings. There has been different writers over the last decade or two that have addressed aspects of this, and I think some have done a reasonably well job. Invariably, there's often, the writer's own belief systems of reality and the universe and everything else kind of mixed in there, some of which may be questionable, some of which may be interesting. Again, it's really on the part of the reader or the viewer, to get their own take on things. I didn't always agree with some of the different takes that some of these contemporary investigators had, but I paid attention to those areas that seemed to be qualifiable and quantifiable. So, in a nutshell, this is going to sound outlandish, and this is probably going to upset and piss off a number of our viewers. But I'm going to pose this, and I'm going to tell you that in my personal subjective view, I actually think that this is largely the reality. This is largely the case. And if this bothers you, then I apologize. It's not my intention to bother you. And again, you can do what you want with the material, but the bottom line is, I'm quite convinced that on the planet now, and probably for at least a millennia before now, we've had a very large section of the human population that is not what a person that has a conscience or a soul or a spirit could actually qualify as being a human being. We have an organism on the planet that has the same physical appearance of human beings, but they don't have the same internal mental or emotional makeup. They have a makeup that's similar, and it's similar enough so that they can integrate, and so that they can kind of like exist and coexist among that other branch of humanity. But they don't have the same intentions. They're not driven by the same impulses or kinds of impulses entirely. And they are not at all sympathetic to the same kinds of things that a human being with a proper kind of conscience would be. Some have categorized these human beings as psychopathic. We've covered psychopathy as a sort of an educational topic on our forums before. We've also talked about secondary psychopathy. Secondary psychopathy being where if you're living in a social system that is being covertly directed or run by leaders who are properly clinically psychopathic, but it just haven't been discovered, to be so overtly, that because they're at the helm of the social structure, the very influence and the mandates and the direction that they push the society in ends up rendering the average citizen as being a secondary psychopathy, meaning that because they're living in an environmental structure that has that nature at its core, they can't help but have it superimposed on them to greater and lesser degrees. Some of the people that have written on this topic think that that there's a very small percentage of clinical psychopaths in the population, and I've heard numbers as low as like around 10%. Some will say 20%, 30%. There's a lot of really good, solid, examinable evidence and documentation literature on the nature of this topic. I would encourage you to avail yourself of. Again, I can't get into all the details here, but one author whose work I enjoy a great deal, I don't agree with everything she says, Laura Jacek. I remember one section of one of the books that she wrote where she talked about how there was actually a proper study done on psychopathy, and I believe that this was in Europe decades and decades ago. And something very strange occurred with that particular body of information. Apparently it got severely interrupted and also restricted and repressed over and over again, and the circumstances were very unusual. What I want you to get a grasp on is that we may be living, and I'm asserting that we are, this is my own personal subjective belief at this point in time, we're living on a planet where not everything that looks human is. And, you know, a question that keeps coming up over and over again with people is, why doesn't man ever learn? You know, why are the most important basic fundamental lessons of our very existence, why do they never arrive? Why can we not live in harmony with our environment? Why are we always having wars? You know, why are vices, you know, so pervasive and prevalent? Why do we have civilizations reach some kind of peak and then decline, often in a horrible way? You know, why do things like the burning down of the Library of Alexandria occur? You know, why does man produce great works of art and knowledge and wisdom, understanding nature, to have most of this, you know, completely erased and then start over again? And usually the reason that we're given is because, well, that's just the way it is. You know, the nature of human beings is such that that's just what we're like, and it's inevitable. You know, we're either going to make it through some magical quantum jump that just never seems to actually happen, or that we might get close to, or we'll just go extinct, or, you know, or something will happen in our environment and we'll go nearly extinct, and then, you know, if we're really super lucky, maybe a small handful of us will survive if there's an ice age coming up or whatever the heck it is, and then maybe we'll rebuild everything and then we'll get another chance. It's very curious that when you take a look at the composite legend of Atlantis, that it matches so well with the current happenings in our contemporary world. You could almost transplant America for Atlantis. You know, there's a lot of, you know, myth and legend and a lot of ridiculous garbage surrounding, you know, the idea of Atlantis. But one thing that keeps coming up is that, you know, they destroyed themselves and that they were harnessing, you know, crystal technology, and it got out of hand and it blew things up, and, you know, the continent sank and all these bad things happened. It's very curious that we're seeing the United States and other countries implementing a global HARP mechanism, and that it's been found on record that the US government and other governments are engineering the weather, and it looks like instruments like HARP are being used in this. Of course, ultimately, if you look at any given installation of a HARP type mechanism, at its very heart, of course, is crystalline technology, you know, circuitry, and the use of frequency modulation. So it's a very uncanny, you know, I'm not saying that that's the case, but it's a very uncanny scenario where supposedly what happened at Atlantis, you know, if you stretch it out only a little bit and you take a look at what's going on right now, it seems to be a weird kind of a match. So imagine this. Imagine if for a very long time there was a species of what we call humans that lived among us, but they weren't really like us. They did not have a care for the environment. They did not believe in any kind of higher order or higher structure. They did not believe in a greater good. But they were very intelligent, and they had a very robust physiology, and they were very good mimics. They were predators, in a sense. And being a predator who's looking only to feed and being very intelligent and very good studied, one might imagine that such a being could observe other beings around it and see what might bring it favor, even if that was to smile or to mimic compassion. You know, it's often, here's something strange, I find. It's often wondered, why is it that politicians in democratic countries make promises, but when they get elected, they never seem to keep the promises that they made? And the weird thing is, there isn't any law in place to force them to keep their promises. I remember years ago I was looking at Canadian legislation, and I had never realized at one point that a politician could basically say anything and get elected, but never be held accountable for any of the promises that they made, at least to a large extent. And I find it very, very strange that not only could they lie to the people and get away with that and not be held accountable, but that there was no law and no momentum and no structure in place, nor plans for there to be anything in place to compel them to keep their promises. So, given the state of the world right now, if such a situation existed where you had a very large population of non-human beings that appeared human, this is going to sound crazy, you know, I realize how this is going to sound, but if such a thing as an alien invasion, you know, were conceptually possible, if there was an intelligent species that wanted to hijack a planet with the minimum amount of effort and the maximum amount of return, and you know, wanted to be able to get the local population, you know, to basically do what it wanted, what better way than to insert a kind of organism in there that looked and sounded and talked and moved like the beings that were dominant on that planet and mess them up, you know, direct and redirect however you wanted things to go and never be caught. You know, if you, and you don't even have to use the, you know, alien invasion example. Just imagine only that you've got a planet full of like creatures that look like human beings, but they are not they cannot be redeemed because they don't actually have the capacity, you know, to function in a certain kind of mental, emotional, or spiritual state. There's a lot of talk about, you know, ascending and unity and oneness, and I think that there's a lot of really, really lovely notions and ideas floating around out there. But I know from personal experience and in my consulting with other people that one of the things that's brought me the greatest grief in my life is believing a fallacy to be true and then ending up running into a brick wall painfully and finding out that what I actually believed was true and may have even incorporated as part of my identity had been false all along. It's not like this idea hasn't been presented to us before. There's a really old campy movie called They Live. If you haven't seen it, it's, if nothing else, it's a piece of entertainment. Maybe it'll provoke some thought and stimulation for you. The idea that only a fraction of the planet may actually be able to care about the environment and may actually be able to want to live in peace and may be capable of working out harmonious relations with their neighbor presents a very disturbing reality, especially if it's a situation where the group of people that are capable of positive change are not aware that half of the people they interact with aren't. And there's a lot of popular momentum. You see a lot of different celebrity spiritual guru types that are promoting different kinds of notions, you know, one of which is this idea of oneness. Assuming that you had a population of beings that actually were the same fundamentally at the core level, then that might be appealing, you know, as long as it wasn't sort of like a generic hive type mind. Although I find that a lot of the notions in this sort of oneness movement actually do present this kind of like dissolving of a sense of, you know, beautiful harmonious individuation into a basically a notion of nothingness, or, you know, oneself, which kind of just seems like one large cyborg Borg like, you know, awareness of nothingness. What I can say is that the research I've done seems to imply that those beings that are psychopathic don't actually have the same kind of sense of individual self that you and I do. You know, assuming that you, the viewer, are an ensouled person with conscience and genuine empathy. They just don't see reality the same way that we do. What's actually going on inside their heads is a completely different landscape. And it's funny when people talk about truth as though it's a subjective thing. So there's my truth, and then there's your truth, and, you know, whatever truth works for you. I'm not saying that there isn't There are not scenarios where there can be degrees of truth for a given situation depending on the perspective taken. My personal take is I think that both exist. There actually are absolute truths, and there are relative truths. An example of an absolute truth is that love is real. It exists. It's an absolute. A relative truth could be something along the lines of this. If an individual is psychopathic clinically, does not have a conscience, and doesn't have a soul, then what's true for that individual is they only have basically the moments to live for, and the thing that they're living for is consumption. They want to consume to sustain themselves, probably by whatever means possible, because for them, in their reality, which is actually very real for them in their state, they are not connected to a higher order. They don't have a sense of empathy. They do not believe that there is anything that's of a divine or a nature of harmony. The vices and virtues are all relative, and they're only relative to how they get their next fix of whatever, whether it's food or money or etc. So if you have someone that's a politician who's a clinical psychopath but has not discovered to be that, that politician will say pretty much anything and will be a really good study of what makes people vote him in. And the only thing he's really after is his own dominance, his own gratification, and that's it. So if you get a bunch of environmentalists or activists who are really concerned about the trees and about the water or the purity of the air, and they all congregate and they have billboards and signs and they march in front of the psychopathic politicians, hangout, and they say, hey, we voted you in. You told us you were one of us. You told us that you're representing us. We're not seeing what we wanted to see happen. Surely you must understand that, we need you to do the job that we elected you to do. How is that politician going to respond? The politician is going to respond basically in a couple of ways. First of all, he's going to likely make a demonstration of sympathy. So lots of smiles and gestures, and he'll talk a certain way, and he'll use his body language, and he'll try to stimulate the emotions of the crowd. Say like, yeah, hey, I really feel you, man. I really care about how you feel, and look at, we're actually doing all of these things. Nothing is conclusive yet because for some reason that I can't disclose entirely, we're still working on it, but it's going to come soon. We've got all these studies going on. In a couple of years, we'll get back to you, but oh wow, I sure care. And oh, by the way, let me kiss your baby and pat them on the head. All he's doing is stalling. And he's stalling long enough to just get more and more and more of whatever he can, while those who are supporting him get the short end of the stick all the time, always, because they don't realize there's a hidden game that's completely camouflaged. One of the problems that exists right now is that the citizens of the world in different countries have no clear-cut way to determine who is psychopathic or not. There's a camouflage in place, and it's very good camouflage. The average human being who is capable of empathy, who's capable of sympathy, who can and would try to make a difference in bringing more peace to the world and living more harmoniously, actually doesn't have a practical way of viewing whether or not the politician is a psychopath or not. And this is interesting because the movie that I mentioned earlier, They Live, the entire premise of the movie is built around that idea. In the movie They Live, and it might sound a little bit silly, but I think it's poignant to our conversation, what happens is they discover this special kind of eyeglass, and when they put it on, they can actually see the control messages hidden in media, and they can actually see the monsters that are pretending to be humans. So when they put the sunglasses on, they can actually see that this person that would normally look like a human actually isn't human at all. And so this is a great threat and danger to the controlling population because they don't want these sunglasses around, they don't want to be found out. So at this present point in time, this has been an enormous advantage of the psychopathic branch of humanity over the other branch of humanity that just can't ever seem to get a break. They can't ever seem to, you know, get the same kind of advantages or benefits that the criminals do. And they're always paying more taxes, and you know they never see, you know, massive breakthroughs in technology or science that can really make, you know, quantum leap jumps in their well-being. You know, there's always poverty, there's always war, there's always growing crime, etc. I remember when I was a really young kid, there was a book that our teacher read, and it was called A Wrinkle in Time. And I remember each class that I would go in, I would be just really engaged. You know, she would read a chapter, I think it was, like each class, you know, until the book was done. And I remember that the entire class pretty much was just quiet, just enraptured by this book. And a short while ago, I think it was probably, it might have been Disney or someplace, made a version of, it was a movie version of the book. And it was a bit campy, a little bit cheesy. They actually didn't do it, you know, too badly. And so all of these thoughts came back again. And I remember my impression of the children in that book, that were like kind of like the, you know, the heroes of the book. They were sensitive, a little bit quiet, deep thinkers. They were kind, and they were generous and loving to each other and to other people. And they tended to be outcasts. They never seemed to fit in with the conventional herd-like social, you know, children in the rest of the school. And so they'd get picked on, and they'd get excluded, and you know, they would often feel kind of disenfranchised. But they also realized that they were happier. There was this fundamental intrinsic part of their sense of inner being where they knew something special. They were connected to something special, and not only was it sufficient for them to be okay, but it also, in the book, it ended up saving the rest of the world. Because, you know, in the story, unbeknownst to the general public, there were very sinister machinations and you know, things going on their planet and across the cosmos that were threatening, you know, the reality of that planet Earth and other parts of space. So bottom line is that they go on a bunch of adventures and they end up on some other planet similar to Earth that's been completely taken over by this hive mind, this collective consciousness, and all of the children and all the people on this planet are all like zombified, you know, yuppies that always cut their grass a certain way, you know, always at a certain time. They all dress the same, they all talk the same. There's no creativity. They just live this like extremely flatline, completely controlled life, and there's no vitality. It's like the, you know, the soul, the spirit, there is none on this planet. And the regulation, the government regulation, the government control of the population of this planet is immense. And I always thought that that was an interesting metaphor, you know, for what we're seeing happening on our planet today. And certainly, you know, the author of A Wrinkle in Time is not the only one that's written about this kind of scenario, because we also have things like George Orwell, you know, who's writing about things like 1984. So we know that this paradigm is well entrenched in part of the human psyche. Through the research and work that I've done, one thing I've become somewhat convinced about is that individuals that might be classified as psychopathic, while they don't have the same kind of sense of self that a normal human being would, I believe that there is a collective intelligence, a kind of group mind that controls them, that they're plugged into in various ways. This might sound outlandish or outrageous. I would encourage you, and again, some of the claims I'm making here are going to sound really, to some people, completely outlandish and outside the box. But I'm going to ask if you have an open mind to seriously investigate the links that I'm placing in the comment section of this video and come to your own conclusion after you've done the study and determine for yourself the veracity of this. One of the things, though, that I'm fairly convinced about is that there is a collective intelligence that is governing this psychopathic species. And an interesting potential support for this comes from the work of a Canadian neuroscientist by the name of Michael Persinger. And for those of you that are on our group, you may have seen, I posted a link a couple of times previously. And essentially, it's a lecture that Persinger is giving, and I believe he's delivering the lecture to Laurentian University. I don't know for sure that it's Laurentian, but I believe it was. The classes, there's probably about, like 20, 30 students in there. And he's presenting some of his findings after many years of work. And I strongly encourage that you watch that lecture because it's very revealing. But one of the key points in that lecture is that Persinger is convinced that the magnetosphere of the planet is directly interactive with individual human consciousness and also group human consciousness. And what he says is that fluctuations in the geomagnetic field directly affect individual and group behavior. He also says that a significant chunk of individual and group awareness is deposited and interacts in that strata. And he claims that when an individual goes to sleep, that it's a common occurrence for part of their mind, their unconscious mind, to either leave, the localized body frame and go up and connect into that, magnetosphere region. Or he says, at the very least, if it's not leaving, then it's somehow connecting in a tensile, informational way, where there is a transaction of knowledge and information back and forth between the individual and whatever is resonant in the magnetosphere, meaning that at any given point in time, if there's any veracity to his argument, and I believe there is, and I think you will too once you've seen his lecture, that a given individual may be transacting and interacting with individuals across the planet during sleep, at least. So when you go to sleep at night and you have a dream about someone you've never met and you're going through certain kinds of activities with them, part of the time it may be just your imagination. Part of the time it may not be happening at all. Part of the time it's just your unconscious ruminating and doing its thing and clearing things out, and it's just untying psychic knots and trying to do whatever it does for house cleaning. Part of the time it might not be that. Part of the time there may actually be some kind of interaction between your mind and some other individual's mind at a distance on the other side of the planet. And when you awake, your conscious self has no real distinctive certain awareness of this. So imagine, what if we didn't just have a scenario in accordance with what Persinger said? What if, as part of the function, or as one of the potential capabilities of the magnetosphere, was if you had a species living on the planet that appeared human, who had some degree of interaction with that magnetosphere, but they only connected to those of their type. In other words, if you had someone that was psychopathic, they may not necessarily, perhaps they can, but they may not be necessarily connecting mainly with others that are not psychopathic, but they may be connecting with others that are psychopathic like them and be directed in a hive-like, collective, Borg-like way. So they're all kind of following the same kind of instruction set as that group mind, and together as a one-minded oneness organism, they are impelled towards causing destruction, chaos, and reveling in it, and being fed from this. Now, I know this is getting weird, but again, I'm going to suggest that you really take a look at the links I provided, because I think that, again, if you have an open mind, you'll begin to see the sense in this. So what if those that had souls, or conscience, or empathy, or whatever, what if they also were able to connect with each other, but what if they were not of a collective mind the same way, whereas they actually, because they have a soul, they retain their individuality. It's been said that something like less than 5% of the population controls 80% of the wealth on the planet. I believe that that small group of elite people are psychopathic, and I believe that they are the most intelligent faction of the psychopathic population. I think that they are knowingly directing the rest of that body, and I think that they utilize the rest of that part of our population in ways that serve their interests. And I think that they think it's to their benefit to make sure that individuals that are conscious, do have a conscience, and do have souls, remain fragmented. They never get to unify. They never get to see what's going on. They're used as a power source. They're drained of their vital energy, and they're essentially a source of food. And it's important to make sure that they don't connect, and that they don't unify, and that they do not become aware that half of the people somewhat that they're interacting with are not like them. It's very advantageous to liberally spread these parasitic organisms that look like human beings as uniformly as possible through the population globally and in the power structure, so that you can keep it under control. Because of the outlandish nature of what I'm sharing to you, if someone were to actually discuss and talk about this, it would probably come across as simply being crazy, unless you start to connect the dots and you do a serious in-depth job of it, and you actually take a look at the data points. So here's something interesting, and this is detailed in one of the links. This is just one of the scientific facts that are examinable that has come to light the last little while. Years ago, perhaps as much as 10 years ago, there was a region of the frontal lobe part of the brain that was identified, and it was loosely called the God module. And it was found that in certain individuals that region was dormant. In other words, there was little to no activity there, typically no activity. In other parts, or in other individuals, that region of the brain was highly active, and it would show up. And they did a number of studies in different universities to actually determine that that was going on. And what they found was that those individuals who might be very intelligent and were able to do reasonably well materially, for themselves in life, but had absolutely no sense of a higher order and very little empathy for their fellow person and no real conscience, that region of the brain was dormant. And the region of the brain in those that believed in, typically, in a higher order, but not like in a, where you've got like say like a sleazy TV preacher who's trying to send the poor, get the retired poor lady to send in her pension check, so she has to eat cat food, but she's sending this TV evangelist cash because she thinks she should to make God happy, and he's bilking her out of her money. I mean, that's not a real spiritual. This is a con man. So what they were talking about were people that had a conscience. They believed in some kind of higher order. They had a strong sense of empathy. They demonstrated, virtue in their lives. They loved and were loved genuinely. This part of the brain was active, and there was a number of things that were presented where they talked about they were quite sure that it was these individuals, historically and traditionally over time, that were engaged in the edification and positive progression and constructive activity towards creating a healthy civilization. So these individuals were the ones that were the stabilizing and vitalizing and creative force in a given civilization. And they surmised that those that had a dormant frontal lobe region, that they called the God module, they said that these were the ones that seemed to typically trigger things like war or disharmony, or were engaged in criminal activity, at high levels. And I mean, certainly you can have a psychopath that, is not like a super intelligent person that is running a corporation. I mean, you have other, psychopaths that may not be, They may be clever and crafty, like a kind of like a Charles Manson, but they're not terribly bright or intelligent in some other areas, but they're obviously like disturbed individuals. So that one example of the God module is not the only one. And there are a number of individuals, institutions that have made a lot of progress and headway into finding data points that support this concept. And again, when you begin to connect these data points together, it forms a pretty tight mesh. It forms a pretty tight weave. I never liked seeing good-hearted, sensitive people suffer unduly. And, you know, because of the work that I do, I get people approaching me that have gone through some debilitating and traumatic life challenges. And, you know, they may have been taken advantage of. They may have trusted someone. You know, someone may be in a business relationship, or they could be in a romantic relationship. It could be someone in their family where they're interacting with. And they put a lot of trust, and they were vulnerable, and they had a lot of attachments and, you know, emotional connection. And then it was just completely broken, and they were devastated, and they didn't know what was going on, and they couldn't make sense of what was going on. One of the things that can happen when this sort of scenario occurs is if you take a relatively healthy person that, you know, is compassionate and is considerate and has a conscience, when you expose them to that kind of trauma, I mean, there's different kinds of ways they can go. You know, hopefully they, you know, best case scenario is they might flounder for a bit, but they get themselves back, and then they begin to heal and they move on, and hopefully they learn something. But a question arises often in people that witness this kind of, you know, very profound disturbance as to why did this have to happen? How can this happen? How can I put my trust in someone and get this degree of betrayal? You know, especially when this person presented such a different image to me. And when I've come across people that I had the impression were good-hearted people, and they meant well, and they were trying to do their best, and they got hit really hard, and they were taking as much responsibility as they could to try to get their lives back on track. I felt for that, and I didn't like to see them suffer. And I'm weary of seeing these kinds of people suffer so consistently over time. And it was very important to me to try to figure out, you know, as much as I could as to what's the causative factor. You know, why is this happening? And certainly I've been through this kind of stuff myself. But also, upon determining at least parts of the why, what can be done about it? And I think that when we have an understanding as to, as shocking and as weird and as disturbing as it might be, when we come to an understanding as to what's actually going on, then from that place, being equipped, we can deal with these vampiric entities. And you know, we can also begin to get latitude. We can begin to hold our own. Because here's the thing. There was a phrase that I came across a while ago, and it went something along the lines of, you can avoid a reality, but you can't avoid the consequences of reality. And by this point in time, it's mid-September 2011, things have gotten pretty bad globally, and there's a whole lot of revelation going on about the depth of corruption all over the place. This is not accidental. This is by design. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to try to reach out to whoever may be watching this video who does have a conscience and who does have a soul, who has not gone to sleep, or who is at least on the verge of awakening, who wants to be okay and wants to make it through this chaos. So I think that as you contemplate what I'm delivering here, and as you review the material that I'm attaching, that you'll have a better chance of doing that. That would be nice. I would really like that to be the case. My opinion is that half the population is not psychopathic of the planet. However, that half that is not clinically psychopathic has been badly damaged and disconnected. And because so much of the population has been traumatized by this other part of the population, they're playing a disassociation game. And the disassociation game, you know, when someone is raped or violently trespassed against, a coping mechanism that they'll use sometimes is to go away inside. You know, they put their hands over their ears or they cover their eyes and say, "God, I'm no longer here. I don't believe this is happening to me." And they fragment, they fracture, they splinter inside, and they make up stories inside of their heads as to, you know, why they will be okay, or why what happened didn't happen the way they think it might, or they create a fantasy world inside that they can escape to. Certainly, when an individual is being traumatized in a way, a coping mechanism can be a very useful and meaningful thing, because it can offer at least some degree of a protective boundary. However, once the trauma has ended and the event has ended, and hopefully they are physically alive, remaining in that coping mechanistic state of disassociation is rarely conducive to their well-being, and it is not likely going to facilitate recovery. If anything, it's going to land them in progressively worse hot water as time goes on. And one of the things that I'm seeing a lot, in lots of different avenues, is a very deeply entrenched, well-maintained, varied, form of disassociation, and also distraction and diversion. And I believe that those nasty individuals that are calling the shots in perpetrating these acts intend that, and I think that they've got it down to a very finely tuned art and science. And that can range from playing Lady Gaga in the grocery store. You're just going in and you want to buy a loaf of bread, and you're getting bombarded with hypnotic bullshit from some pop star who's probably all kinds of dysfunctional and messed up, to the rest of your social structure. And if you're an individual who is awake and does have a conscience, you probably may be finding yourself in situations where you may feel alone to different degrees, because it's not exactly like you can bring these kinds of topics up at the local house party or at your neighbor's barbecue, because so many other people are so deeply entrenched in their hypnosis that you're just going to basically disturb them, and they're not going to want to hear it, or they're going to label you crazy. What was that one quote? Something about when you live in a sick society. If you're a well-adjusted citizen in a sick society, the sick society will call you maladapted, something along those lines. So what needs to happen is you first need to become aware of some of the details of what's going on and what's been going on. And at some point, you need to get some support. You also need to be equipped to be able to properly discern and differentiate between friend and foe. My personal opinion is these predators, these psychopathic predators that are on the planet right now in mass, they aren't going to get better. They are not capable of getting better. They cannot be rehabilitated. They cannot and will not change. They have every intention of doing exactly what they've been doing until extinction, until they're physically stopped. And If they are not physically stopped by the rest of the population, then it will be nature itself, where they'll simply cause so much decay that the entire planet collapses and they end up killing themselves and everyone else along with them. And that's it. That's the reality of it. So at this point in time, as of today's date, my opinion is that things are probably going to get progressively a lot worse. There is not a critical mass of the population that is aware of this information, and there certainly isn't enough people that will act upon this information. And so what I would suggest to you is that if you are someone who has a soul and a conscience and you're capable of empathy, etc., you need to get up to speed on this material, and you need to begin to develop ways where you can discern who you can rely on and who you can't. One of the most important things, and something that you can do immediately, that you can begin to start to do, is to educate yourself on what the defining characteristics of an atypical psychopath is, a vampire. Become well studied in this, so that you have an internal mental checklist and you're paying attention and you're observing the kinds of behavior that you're noticing with an individual that you're interacting with. And you can find some of that on our website. There's one other thing I want to share with you, and that is that there is a phenomena that is related to a time function of the psychopathic psyche. There's also a range or a kind of gradient or degree of psychopathic behavior. In other words, not all psychopathics are a 10 out of 10 complete psychopath. Not all psychopaths are Hitler. Not all psychopaths are Charles Manson. And not all psychopaths are consistently in a psychopathic predatory mode demonstrably, overtly over time. So what I mean by that is that let's say that there's someone in your life who is a clinical psychopath, but you have not yet determined that that's what they are. You're not going to notice that, in some cases, you're not going to notice that that's what they are all the time, because their mind will click through cycles or periods over a given chunk of time. And it's usually, you can usually notice any aberrations over a lunar cycle. So roughly about 28, 29 days. And there's other cycles that will come into play as well. But if you know somebody, I want you to, I've used this example before. In the nature of the work that I've done, I found that there is a kind of geometry that forms in the psyche. And it behaves different ways in different kinds of conditions and at different times or different cycles. So that what that means is that a given person's mind is a complexity of different kinds of personas. For those of you that may be familiar with Carl Jung's work with archetypes, we've talked about this in other videos. Imagine that you have a diamond, and the diamond has many facets, many faces, and it has one overall shape. So every facet or every plane of the crystal, if we look at this object by way of comparison to our mind, we could say that every facet or plane of the crystal is analogous to a personality type. So this could be like the roles that we play, for instance. You might be, conceptualizing or viewing one given person in your mind. This could be a friend, or your lover, your wife, your husband. And when you imagine them in your mind, you may see them from different kinds of perspectives. So sometimes you may see them in the capacity of a friend, or in the capacity of a provider, or in the capacity of an intimate lover, or mother, confidant. And there's certainly like a shared commonality or connection, but there's a certain kind of definition and resolution to that definition. In other words, you could be viewing your partner as mainly a friend and a mother, a little bit. Mainly a mother or a little bit of a friend. These modes of being change over time, and they're more prominent or more active. And in some cases, they may simply be learned behaviors, or they could be an intrinsic part of the psyche. They can be a mix of both. But one thing to keep in mind, too, is that the way that human beings evolve or develop is that not all of one's conscious expression or even awareness of how to express or awareness of self is always an immediately present property. And not only that, but in some cases one's persona is not even an emergent quality until a certain point in life. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. If you take a 5-year-old boy, the 5-year-old boy will have a very limited expression of self in contrast to an adult. In other words, the little boy does not have the capacity to be a father or a provider. The little boy may play act or pretend or imagine himself to be in that role, but there isn't any real depth resolution or concrete definition of that role being present and fixed in that boy's mind or psyche in any way near the depth resolution that you would find in, say, an adult, typically. And on top of that, when you have an individual that is growing over time, so from very young to young adults to middle age, reflections of a sense of self and an understanding of the relationship of self to the environment and the relationship of self to other, these are qualities that are emergent at different points in their life, where they may not even be able to imagine what a certain kind of sense of self would be like until a certain point in time. Another example is you take boys and girls that are in a grade class or in grade 3. Well, the little boys and the little girls may not like each other. The little boys may not be attracted to little girls, and they can't even imagine what it would be like to have an adult sexual relationship or an adult romantic relationship, or what it would, and they don't even want to hang out with each other. So there's not even an ability to conceptualize. But this can become much more distinctive even when you're, say, like in your 20s or in your 30s. So there may be an intrinsic part of self which has not yet blossomed, it has not come out, it is not even, there's not even an awareness of the individual to the, to that role or to that persona or to that type of their aspect of their personality. But separate from this, if you take, say, an average adult, male or female, they're in their mid-20s to mid-30s, older, not all of their personas will be present all the time. So if you know somebody, you will notice state change in them over time, and there will be variance in accordance with things like the degree of stress that's on them, or the kinds of stimulation that they're under. So you will see different aspects of the person. This is why you might know someone for a year, and then you've never seen them angry, and then you see them angry, and you're like totally surprised, like, oh, I never knew that you were angry that way. Another thing is you might know, say, like a friend or acquaintance who you work with, and you've never seen them inebriated. You've never seen them, drunk. And one day, you see them, they've had one too many beers, and a totally different side of their personality comes out. So when we're dealing with someone who's a psychopath, the same kind of modus operandi or the same kind of mode of operation is in place, but with a difference. And the difference is this: there is not a core personality. So if you know someone who you're close to, and they're not psychopathic, and they're a healthy, well-adjusted, reasonably well-adjusted person, as well as anybody can be in this kind of society, typically you'll get at least repeat moments where you see and experience what you're pretty sure is a core sense of self. And when they go under stress, whatever personality may be emerging or may be coming to the surface of their expression or they're demonstrating, whether it might be an angry reaction or a happy reaction or whatever, there will usually be a notable internal reference to their core self. So for instance, your friend becomes really angry, and instead of going overboard in their anger, they have the ability and the wherewithal to be able to consciously relate back to an inner core self that is their foundation, and that they attempt to navigate and guide themselves through life mostly. And if they are aware that their anger is getting it too out of control, it's like, oh, my core self is saying, okay, I need to, regardless that this is my angry self, I need to kind of like draw this in. Psychopaths don't have that core. There's nothing there. And a good way to conceptualize this is if you took 7 pennies and you put them on a kitchen table, and you put 1 penny down and you put 6 pennies around them. The penny in the center is like your core self, and then the pennies on the periphery are the different expressions of personality that may become active in a given moment. So for you being a healthy, person with a soul and conscience, your core self is always there. It may be more or less submerged, but it's always there. So the psychopath, a psychopath only has personalities in the periphery and has nothing at the core. And what you'll see is that one of the ways to spot the psychopath is that these different personalities cycling around that void will flip in and out over time. And they'll tend to rely probably on maybe 2 or 3, that are dominant, that they usually use to manipulate things in their environment with. But every once in a while, on a cyclic time basis and also on an environmental basis, you'll see like a weird kind of a skip or flip. And you'll see either what looks like a distinctive void, which will, when you witness it, it comes across as being scary and disturbing and menacing. One thing is with the psychopath, you usually see like this kind of very acidic, empty, hollow, very mean-looking gaze, which usually only lasts momentarily and then it's gone. And the thing that's weird is that they'll often be smiling when that appears. So one of the things to do is to closely observe someone over time and through different environmental stresses. And that's not to say you should go on a witch hunt. Like, you can have the best friend in the world and they're not a psychopath, and they may go a little bit bananas on the full moon, and then they're back to normal, and they, they're not causing any undue harm and whatever. But I'm just saying that when someone is of a psychopathic nature, to watch and scrutinize their behavior over time in different circumstances. This is one thing that can help you. The other thing I've noticed too is that with my frequencies, I've noticed that individuals that seem to fit a psychopathic profile tend to have a deep aversion to my frequency work. It's as though it causes them discomfort. And individuals that seem to be somewhat connected to their heart seem greatly attracted and drawn to my work. And I'm not saying that everyone that doesn't appreciate my work or doesn't like it or doesn't benefit from it is a psychopath, because I don't think that's the case. I think that the nature of the work I've been doing frequency-wise is simply a better fit for some people than others. But what I can say is that I've been in situations where I have directly observed repetitively individuals that seemed, to my mind, subjectively, be closer to what I would consider a psychopathic profile that really didn't like being exposed to the frequencies at all. And I can say that over the last 4 years, that those individuals that gravitated towards my work and seemed to benefit from the most didn't exhibit psychopathic behavior. I can't think of one individual that stood out as displaying distinctive psychopathic characteristics that really benefited from my work. And I'll give you an example. This is just a mild example. I was at a trade show years ago, and the purpose of the trade show was a health, like an alternative health type show. And at that show, we had some booths set up, and we were displaying the frequencies. That's a demonstration. It was on a loop. I think we had like 5 tracks or something, playing bits of it. And it wasn't super loud. But one of the things with the work that I do is that the sound carries, even when the volume or amplitude is low. So it can be very pervasive, even if it's very crowded and very busy. And what was interesting was watching the reaction. There's a lot of people at the show, so I had a chance to, real-time observe a very large, number of people from all kinds of different backgrounds interacting, responding, and that sort of thing. And we would have individuals that would come up and be really interested, and they would be drawn to it, and they would be, there would be things that they would be saying or how they'd be behaving, and it was clear that this was something that was having a positive effect on them. And then there would be other individuals, thankfully, that were in the minority that didn't like it at all, and acted really strangely. There was a booth that was a good distance away, quite a distance away, and the booth was, they were selling some kind of a health food. It was like, I think it was a greens product of some kind. I can't remember what the brand name was. I wouldn't say if I could remember. This is on the West Coast, and so they were selling different kinds of nutritional powders and this kind of thing. And I'd walked through the trade show a few times to kind of get a feel for what I was dealing with and the kind of people that were there. And, it was the first trade show that I'd actually demonstrated my work at. And I had noticed that the people that were at that booth, at that particular booth, they all had very finely manicured appearances. They looked like they had sort of those fake and baked tans, like the tanning salon. Their hair looked almost artificially too proper in place. Their faces looked like they were just a little bit too well made up, like absolutely perfect makeup. Attractive looking people, very well dressed, and they would be very elegant, like the kind, like news anchors, like like the talking heads on the evening news. The perfect teeth, and the long fingernails, and the way that they would interact with people, like very, very smooth, very slick. They absolutely hated my frequencies. It was driving them bananas, and they would come over with a big forced grin on their face, and this is the weird thing. It's like they were spying on us for hours. They'd walk by and they would just and they had no reason to even walk past my booth because they had a big enough crowd they're selling nutritional powders to, and they were pretty busy and actively engaged. But for some reason, on a regular basis, a bunch of them would keep cycling over and checking us out. And the volume over frequencies was not that loud, and there was quite a loud background din in the trade show. So I thought this was very strange. So what ended up happening was they'd made a series of complaints to the management because they said that it was driving them nuts. So we kept turning it down, until it got to the point where it was so low that people could barely hear it when they walked past the booth. In contrast, here's an example of a person that walked past and had an incredibly positive experience to the frequencies. A little old lady, she must have been about 80 or something, and she was small and thin, and she was wearing like a threadbare jacket. It was like I think it was like a tweed of some kind, and it looked like it had been a nice jacket at one point. Maybe it had been expensive, and it was worn. And she looked very thin and a bit gaunt. She had a twinkle in her eyes, and she was walking past our booth. She stopped, and she didn't say anything. And she walked in closer, and she just stood there. And I noticed her right away. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't entirely sure what she was going through. She cocked her head to one side, and she started to cry. And there were tears coming out of her eyes, and she just started to smile. And I just sat there feeling, I guess, overwhelmed and happy. And like, something was touching her, and she was getting something meaningful to her, and that was a good feeling. And I waited for a while, and then I talked to her, said, how are you, and are you okay? And it's probably something along the lines of, what are you going through? And I don't want to toot my own horn here or anything, because that's not what I'm trying to do, but her basic response was that it had reached her, and that she was thankful for it. And then I'm guessing her son came up. I'm guessing it was her son. Her son was probably about, I don't know, like maybe in his mid to late 50s, and the three of us just talked there, and so it was it was a good moment, and it was the right kind of moment. It was a heartful moment, and so the point of that is just that one of the things that you may find helpful at times, this may occur, is that if you're in a situation where you may be surrounded by a kind of psychopathic energy, or there may be an individual or individuals that may be in proximity to you that you may be concerned about that may be psychopathic, this may be something that you could try to experiment with, selecting different kinds of frequencies and observing what happens. And you might notice some interesting things. We know that those of our members that are we have some members that are professional paranormal investigators. They're not quacks, they're not illegitimate, flakes. I've looked at their credentials. I know where they're coming from. They're actively involved in doing field work, and they're getting good results. We know that these individuals have tested some of the frequencies that are designed for their particular line of work, and they've gotten consistently good results. So this is, to my mind, a strong indication that this could be also helpful in this situation. But what's really, really important for you is that at this point in time, and from this point forward, for likely at least the next year or two, you need to have some means or method to be able to scrutinize and discern who in your local sphere is for real, who is either a psychopath or has been bent into a secondary psychopathy. And keep in mind that a person can be a normal individual. They may not be a psychopath, but they may have been biased into psychopathic behavior because of their own pressures, their own environmental or experiential pressures. So you can have like a normal human being who may be somewhat asleep at the wheel, and they're not acting in a beautiful way. They're not coming from a conscious, aware place, and they may not be a clinical psychopath, but they may be a functional psychopath. You want to keep these kinds of individuals as much as possible at a distance if you're going to make it, generally. This is my personal opinion, and you need to have a way to be able to detect them. And there are a number of ways of doing this. It's very important for you to have a detection method, and it's also very important for you to have a way of managing those individuals that you've determined are likely psychopathic once you've detected them. So I'm not going to cover all of that here, but I encourage you to investigate that and to check it out. Also check out the links that I've posted here. And I want to encourage you that, if you're someone that has been noticing an increase in strange behavior in the local population, if you're seeing like a rise in aggression or just like chaotic behavior, this isn't an accident. There are reasons that this is happening, and I want to describe something that I've been witnessing too, because this keeps coming up. It's it's funny because it's something that it was a kind of a bitch or a complaint or something that I've been upset about for a while, but I've been hearing a lot of this kind of thing coming in from different areas. I'm just going to give you an example. Years and years ago, I used to live in Alberta, Canada, and there's a city in Alberta called Edmonton, and there was a region in the city called Old Strathcona, also called White Avenue. In essence, you had probably somewhere on the order of about roughly 20 city blocks, and it was kind of shaped in an L. So it was White Avenue, 82nd Avenue, started at about 100th Street, and it went right down the avenue to about 109th Street, and then it went down 109th Street to about roughly 90th some avenue. So it was an L shape. And for a period of years, it was an absolutely beautiful area. It's like that chunk of the city was populated by vibrant, creative, good-hearted, intelligent people all up and down the place, both residentially and commercially. There were very little franchises of any kind. There was really no big business. There were a number of shops because it was an area that had both a good mix of, like I say, like residences and also commercial venues. But the area was known to be a kind of busy hub for people that were in the arts and other kinds of creative fields. So you had painters and sculptors and a lot of writers. You had people that were in the theatrical arts, and not predominantly like say like really flaky actors and actresses type thing. I mean, there's always in any kind of discipline or field, you're always going to have good people and people that are a little bit wacko. So there were certainly eccentrics, that were in this area, but they tended to be very good-hearted eccentrics, and they got along well, and they treated each other well. And I was very fortunate because I got a chance to live in that area for a time. And when I didn't live in the area, I would drive a great distance. I would drive about 40 minutes just to be in that place on the weekend for the sheer atmosphere and the feeling of it. And a typical day for me would be I'd go walking down the street, and on a beautiful blue sky, puffy cloud, Saturday afternoon, I would interact and meet all kinds of happy, friendly people with lots of beautiful, intelligent things to share with me. I'd walk into a bookstore, and when I would go into a little bookstore run by a family, and it would have like an old style, kind of like nice looking green veranda up front, and you'd go inside the bookstore, and it would be, not a huge inner space, but there would be a lot of well-maintained bookshelves with beautiful old books that have been, painstakingly collected and, categorized into like really interesting subject titles. And they would have like a very small little cafe inside there. And it was very normal to walk in, and nestled in the center, in the middle of this, bookstore, be, two, maybe three little green tables with people sitting around it. And there might be a few on the outside, sitting outside and enjoying, the sunny atmosphere outside. And it was very common for me to walk in, and there might be like 5 or 6 people sitting around this table. It could be a lawyer, talking with a punk rocker with a mohawk who was an anarchist, and a hippie that was maybe missing a few teeth and always liked to smile. Some university students, and maybe someone that was a tradesperson that was a welder. And they'd all be friends, and they'd all be sitting around the table, and they'd be genuinely enjoying each other and talking and respecting each other. And it was a beautiful thing to walk into. And this kind of energy, this kind of atmosphere was pervasive all up and down this entire area. And it was like that for years. And they actually had a mandate. There was a council that was in place that was in charge of managing the development of the region. And their job was to maintain a happy, healthy atmosphere without allowing it to become overdeveloped. And there was a lot of historic sites that were maintained, beautiful old buildings, really quite exquisite, like the way the buildings were constructed, the structure. It was beautiful. It was really, really beautiful, and a lot of very old homes. So there was a legacy to this place. And what happened was there was one individual that sat on the council board, and this individual, from what I understood, this is the rumor that I heard, arranged things behind the scenes without the understanding and knowledge of everyone else to break their protective envelope over the area and to allow for grotesque overdevelopments and for an influx of bars and nightclub type things. And there was a bunch of fires. There were businesses that had been there for a long time. One was this place called the Wee Book Inn, and it was there for quite some time, and it was a huge popular favorite, cultural icon. And there was another place that was a pancake house, and it was old. It had been there for a long time. It was beautiful. It was elegant and quaint, and it was a great place for friends to go and just hang out. A lot of these businesses that had been there for some time mysteriously went up in flames. They burnt to the ground. So the end result was that franchises came in, and bar scenes came in, and the entire place got transformed into this gross, ugly, polluted atmosphere where there was litter and garbage on the streets and people throwing up and pushing waste cans over. The whole place was transformed from this beautiful cultural oasis into a wasteland of human excrement and an embarrassment, and dangerous. And the city itself, in a short number of years, actually held the title of being the murder capital of Canada. And it was heart-wrenching to watch this happen. And it was done for money. And what was crazy was that the draw that brought all of these people in was that they were hungry and wanted to feed on the original energetic atmosphere there. So instead of them actually resonating to the harmony that was there, instead of them, honoring and respecting and allowing that to exist, they just wanted to consume it. They wanted to feed on it. They wanted to make the scene and look cool, like they were going to White Avenue, but their very presence and their very intention, especially their intention, completely destroyed it. And so now what's there are huge amounts of cops that stroll up and down all the you'd almost never see cops in that area. And then choppers, helicopters, every Friday, Saturday night, with searchlights all over the place. Thousands and thousands of people that are drunk, stupid, and silly, that are, it's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. What I found was really interesting was that this particular kind of transformation wasn't just happening in Edmonton. It was happening in all kinds of different places, in all kinds of different ways. When J.R.R. Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings, I think it was an interview, or he was being asked by someone, about why he wrote the book. He had different reasons for writing the books that he did. One was he was sending letters to his son that was in the war, and he wanted to give his son something beautiful and interesting to read while he was engaged in the war. But Tolkien had said that when he was young, and this is decades and decades ago, that when he was growing up, he lived in this beautiful little English town, and it was clean air, clean water, happy people. And he said that he noticed and observed over time that whatever was beautiful there was being gobbled up, and these ugly, smoky factories were coming in, and a different breed of people were coming in, and it basically got erased. And this was where he got his idea of Mordor, like the land of desolation, full of monstrous creatures. So that particular kind of transformation isn't new, and I'm certainly not the only one that's seen it. And if I were to have a casual conversation with someone, their response to me might be like, well, that's just the way it is. That's human progress. That's what happens. But actually, that's not entirely true, because from what I've seen, this isn't an accidental oopsie of generic human nature. This is actually something that is both intentional and by design, and it also seems to be, to a large extent, a characteristic property of the psychopathic personality type. One of the things that I want to encourage you to do and to be aware of is that although things may look bleak and challenging on the global scene, and while you may have gone through experiences in your life where you may feel like overwhelmed by not having a better community, or consistently, or by not there may be times if you're a loving human being with conscience and soul, you might feel disconnected from whoever your people are. But I want to encourage you and tell you that they're out there, and they exist, and it's not your imagination, and they're real. And if you have them in your life right now, then that's fantastic, and I hope that you hold on to them and I hope that you have a way to discern against what that energy isn't. And if you don't have that energy in your life, to the extent that you would like, then I would like to inspire and encourage you to tell you that it is out there. Energy isn't lost. It just changes form. So it goes someplace else. And my hope is that you arrive at a place and in a circumstance, in a situation where you're able to not only experience and witness this, but you have a way to protect it and to be vigilant and to also manage and avoid the craziness that often tries to hunt this kind of beautiful energy down and consume it. And there's nothing wrong with being aware of how things are, and there's nothing wrong with trying to protect it and wanting to protect it. And my suggestion to you is that it's your responsibility. It is your responsibility to be aware, and it is your responsibility to protect, this kind of existence. Because if you don't, nobody else will. Or at least if people like you don't, then we're going to end up with, we're going to have the same outcome as Easter Island. Like Easter Island at one point was paradise. And I'm sure that there were a lot of really good people there. But there was also some psychopathic tendencies that had somehow wafted in. And there were some crazy, impulses that they allowed to take control of their society as a whole. And in the end, they ate themselves, and most of them died, and their environment couldn't support themselves anymore. And so from this point forward, if you haven't already, you need to be able to discern who the vampires are, deal with them effectively, and you need to be able to network with people that are like you. You need to be able to work and collaborate together. You need to have support, and depending on how bad things get, you need to have some kind of plan, worst case scenario, to get to some place that you can be okay and be safe and flourish and thrive and survive. So there's a lot more I wish I could share with you, and I've only really talked a very tiny fraction of this. There's so much more to all of this, but my hope is that this has popped some lights on in your mind for you, and that this gives you some encouragement, and that you feel hopeful and you feel empowered. And sending you much love and support, and hold that banner high. Sunny days are, in beautiful spaces and harmonious places are very real, and they can exist, and it's up to you and I to build them and to make them real.